what you would like to hear next time. So keep that in mind. So this is essentially the third in the series. And I actually, to tell you the truth, had the hardest time choosing what to speak about tonight. The first two were easy. You know, we spoke predominantly in the beginning about what happened 70 years, so to speak, around 70 years after Churban Bayis Rishon at the hands of the Babylonians. And with this heralding call of Cyrus the Great and Persia really under their jurisdiction and payments, helping the Jews go back to Eretz Yisrael and to rebuild anew. We saw that the Jews did not necessarily have all the excitement we wanted them to have. They shalo alu kichoma, they did not go back, and therefore, because their numbers were paltry, they did not have the pomp and circumstance that we would have expected and we would have liked to see. And because of that, again, it's the chicken or the egg. Did they not come back and therefore there were trouble, or was there trouble because they didn't come back? You know, that's a whole debate. We saw that they felt very forsaken by Hashem until they were reinvigorated by Haggai and Zechariah nearly 20 years later. And where we left off last week is that we
You're
saw
frozen.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. You said something?
You were frozen. It's okay. You're back on.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Thank you for telling me. Okay. So with the help of Haggai and Zechariah and their inspiration, the Jews went back to building. Haggai is one of the, I would say, most successful Nevi'im. In less than 3 months, he really invigorated their spirit, and they all came, with this Nike mentality of just do it. Aluha harva avetem eitz. Wherever you can manage to get a tree, Hashem doesn't care if it's cedar trees from the Lebanon forest. He really just wants to see that you create a space for him. And with Haggai, his perfect bipartisan ticket, like I mentioned, Rav Menachem Leibtag always likes to say that Haggai is the kippah sruga, and Zechariah is the black hat. Zechariah seems to be less involved with the politics and more involved with their re-inspiring the relationship that they had with Hashem and letting them know that even if you build, the same thing that happened to you last time will happen again if your relationship with Hashem is not solidified. We talked about one of the most famous, shilas ever that we see in Tanakh, but really the first responsa literature, so to speak, is when the Jews of Shushan who have not made Aliyah send messages to Zechariah and Yerushalayim saying, hey, you're 2 years shy of the culmination of Chanukah Habayit. Should we still be fasting for Tisha B'Av and Asara B'Tevet and all these other days if the Beis HaMikdash is almost complete? And the answer that we saw Zechariah give with a sense of humor, like a Jew answers a question with a question, is, well, we didn't create these fasts, you did. And if you think the reasons for the fast are still significant, then you should still be fasting. But if the reasons no longer exist, then there's no need to fast. But ultimately, Zechariah ends his message, and I told you that beautiful story of my grandfather, Alav Shalom, on the benches of Yerushalayim with myself, the oldest granddaughter and all these young grandchildren, recognizing that true Geula will only come when the elderly of Yerushalayim can sit in peace with the younger generations, and they're sitting there with their canes, not because they're canes of war, because they're canes of old age and their excitement to go out. And really with Zechariah, that message is heralded, and what we're going to get to tonight is the completion of Bayit Sheni. So that's kind of where we left off last week, and with that I want to pick up, unless you first have any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions before I begin. Anyone? Okay, so ultimately the message of Zechariah, and this is how that perek of the responsa ends, is he gives them this recipe for survival. You're building the Beis HaMikdash now. You don't want to be fasting again. You want this to be eternal. You want this to have long-lasting significance. Let me give you the secret recipe for success. Dabru emet ish esra'ehu, speak to each other in honesty and in truth. Seek out your friends, your colleagues, mishpat shalom shiftu b'shareichem, and make sure only judgments of peace are enduring throughout the judgments of your cities. He lets them know that social justice is of the highest order. And we know that, from Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu and Amos and so many of the earlier Nevi'im, that was not the case, unfortunately, by Rishon. And Zechariah wants to kind of solidify this second Beis HaMikdash with those very, very important calls to action. And Hashem lets them know, I cannot handle imbalances and corruptions in society, that just will not work. That's what Hashem lets them know. And because of that, if you keep to that and you understand it, then Hashem promises us Tzom HaRevi'i, V'Tzom HaChamishi, V'Tzom HaShvi'i, which is Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, and Tzom Gedaya, V'Tzom HaAsiri, and Asar B'Tevet will be for all of Yehuda, L'Sason, L'Simcha, U'Lemo'adim Tovim. And ultimately, these days of mourning will become days of sadness. Will become days of gladness and joy. V'ha'emet, v'ha'shalom, ehavu. And essentially, that is your recipe. As long as love and truth and peace are coming together consistently, then you're good to go. What's interesting here, not necessarily important for our story, is that this is the first time that you have here in the highlighted green that the Jewish people are referred to as Yehudim. And it doesn't necessarily mean the people of Judea, which until now, somebody from Yehuda went from Judea or from Shevet Yehuda. Zechariah ends his Nevuah by telling them that in those days, in these like halcyonic days, 10 men or a quorum of men from foreign nations will come, and they will hold on to the coattails of the Jewish man because they recognize, we want to follow the Jewish people. Basically, this understanding, like we have from Yeshayahu of Ki Mitzion Teitzei Torah, we want to follow the Jewish people. That really is the utopia that we want to grab onto. For those of you that are holding in Megillat Esther chronology, only because we touched upon this last week, I want to mention one tiny little thing, which I know could become a tangent, and I'm going to pretend I don't hear your questions when you try to make it a tangent. Notice all of the fast days that Zechariah promises will become days of gladness that now we think of as part of the Chorban fast days. One of them that's not here is Tanit Esther, which we will be fasting next week. The only reason why I'm mentioning this is because to me, this is one of the proofs that in the time of Zechariah, the Purim story had not yet happened, but the Jews are about to finish building Bayit Sheni. So the approach that Zechariah is before, that Beis HaMikdash comes way after Esther and her son Daryavish build it, which is a midrashic approach, doesn't necessarily resonate with history. And you actually see Zechariah kind of intimating that here. Doesn't touch upon it, but to me, that's kind of, the tone that I get here. Again, that's very tangential. Okay, so now let's get to where we are today. What we need to, in the story, after Zechariah tells them, only fast if you feel you need to, now the Jews, with the inspiration of Haggai and Zechariah, have to put their money where their mouth is and finish building, right? This is what we've been waiting for since the Cyrus Declaration. And we get to Ezra Perek Vav, and I skip to Pasuk Yudalad, and finally we're going to see an unbelievable Chanukah Bayit Sheni. And from here on in, we're really going to use Ezra as a model of leadership. And we're going to examine kind of two different areas of his leadership. Does he use power? Does he use persuasion? Things like that. And what are some of his leadership traits that makes it so successful? So I want to focus only on the light blue, and I'm not even going to read it in the Aramaic. I'm going to just tell it to you in English, that basically it lets us know that by the 6th year of Daryavish, and if Daryavish begins in 522 BCE, the 6th year is 516 BCE, on the 3rd day of the month of Adar. So that's sometime this week, right? I don't even know what day we are today. We're Hey Vav, I'm not even sure. So a couple days ago, Gimel Adar was the date that they completed Bayit Sheni, 516. That is exactly 70 years after Churban Bayis Rishon at the hands of the Babylonians. So if the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash happens in 586, 70 years later, they actually put the finishing touches on the second Beis HaMikdash. And we see here in Pasuk Tet Zayin, they made Chanukat Beit Elokah Dina Bechedva. There was an unbelievable celebration. Chedva is not just joy, it's joy that like you can't, you become speechless about. You can't put it into words. That's what chedva is. And finally, that's really a good thing for us because up until this point, every time we saw the Jews celebrating, when they first came back to Eretz Yisrael and they started to build the Yesod for the Beis HaMikdash, the foundation, we saw that the young generation was celebrating, where we saw that back in Perek Gimel of Ezra, but the elderly were not celebrating because they saw that there's a tremendous discrepancy between the foundation of Bayit Sheni and what Bayit Rishon was in their memory. But here, the Jews are really all on one page. and they're celebrating because they recognize what a tremendous thing this was. 1 month later, they celebrate Korban Pesach the way it's supposed to, and the pasuk tells us that they did it the way it's supposed to be done from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And what's interesting is that it tells us that they're separating the Chol HaNivdal mitumat go'ei haaretz. So it's kind of pinging us with this understanding that in order for them to be makriv Korban Pesach, they made sure to separate themselves from the nations of the world. So does that mean there were people that were intermarried that are separating? Does that mean that they're just together in business? The Mefarshim kind of disagree over there. And then ultimately it tells us in Pasuk Chafbet, Vayasu Chag Matzot Shivas Yamim, for 7 days they kept Pesach bisimcha. Again, another level of joy. So we really see that the emotions of the people are exactly what we had hoped since 539. And the reason why they're happy, ki simcham Hashem, because Hashem gladdened them. And I want to talk for a second about the word simcha. I'm going to unshare because it's something that I heard this week, and I've said it over multiple times already this week, and it means a lot to me, what I heard. Rav Rafal Pelkovitz, who's the father of Dr. David Pelkovitz, tries to compare the difference between simcha and happiness. And the reason why I'm mentioning it now is because it comes up here in our parak, the idea that Hashem was misameach the people, but also we are now in the month of Adar, right? Mishanichnas Adar Marbim b'simcha. Rav Rafal Pelkovitz tells us that the word happy, the etymology is happenstance, or something to happen upon me. So if I'm walking down the street and I happen to find a $5 bill, I get so excited, all of a sudden I'm happy and I want to buy an extra ice cream or something, right? Depends what I find. So the happiness kind of finds me, is projected onto me by an external event, an external occurrence. But those kinds of moments are fleeting. They're not necessarily something that's internal. It's I got lucky. I'm in the moment. The word simcha, says Rav Rafal Pelkovitz, comes from a combination of two words. It comes from the word sam moach, to place your seichel, to put your heart, your mind, that if you want to feel true joy, if you want to be aligned with the values of Hashem, that's a decision. It's not something that's going to happen to you. And that kind of inner joy has much more staying power. When you make a decision to understand that even if I don't understand what Hashem is doing, but I recognize that He has my best interest in mind and He's carrying me through whatever it is I'm going through, that's a simcha that I can wrap my head around, because that's lasim moach, and that really is eternal and longstanding. And I think that the people here understand that. I mean, they have been through hell and back, pardon my French, in the last 18 years, 20 years to try to build the Beit HaMikdash with the Amei Haaretz, with the Shomronim attacking them, with not knowing whether or not the Nevi'im are on their side and not knowing what Hashem wants from them. And it's going to keep coming out of them. As much as Persia is benevolent to the Jewish people, it doesn't get necessarily easier with Persia. Had we had time to go through Nehemiah, we would see that as well. But the Jews consistently from here on in are happy, ki simcham Hashem, because they understand that this is what Hashem wants, and they work on their internal joy because of it. Okay, so let's finally meet Ezra. Who is he, and why have we not met him at all? So in truth, Ezra seems to make Aliyah only 58 years after the completion of Bayit Sheni. So he's really silent for the first 78, 80 years of his own book. And here, we're told in Pasuk Vav of Perek Zayin, who is he? After he gives the yichus, basically, that he comes directly from Aharon HaKohen, so he lets us know that he's a legitimate Kohen, because as we saw earlier, if they could not prove their yichus, they had to be sent home. They were patur from working in the Beis HaMikdash. And Ezra tells us, who is he? Who Ezra Allah mi Bavel, who Sofer Mahir. He is a fine scholar. He's a scribe. B'Toras Moshe. He knows how to read the original font of Moshe. This is around the time that the font changes. I don't know if you've ever seen the difference between the font that they had, Ktav Ashuri versus Ktav Ivri. So this is around the time that it changes. Asher Natan Hashem Elokei Yisrael. He knew better than anyone. And because of that, somehow there was a beautiful relationship between Artaxerxes, also known as Artaxerxes, the current emperor of Persia, with Ezra. He recognized, even though he's a Persian, semi-deity, that's how they looked at Artaxerxes, that Ezra is a man of God, and he really granted him a lot of permissions that we never would have expected. To be, for example, and we're not going to go through the parak, he gives Ezra a licensed document as Ezra makes Aliyah, letting him know that when you get back to Israel, you should enforce Torah law. To the point where, imagine somebody, knocks on the door of a teenager nowadays who chas v'shalom may or may not be looking at a phone that might be on in the other room just to check a text. in the time of Ezra, he could go to jail for that or be fined or even killed, at least according to what Arachashasta mandates. Ezra, though, on the other hand, will never use his power. Instead, he will use the art of persuasion to conspire the people to do what's right. He doesn't necessarily try to separate between church and state, but people recognize that Ezra really is the leading figure in Torah, and they want to kind of mimic those values. And it's pretty impressive that Arachashasta recognized that about Ezra. One of the things I like to call Ezra, and I have it highlighted here all over the place in turquoise, you'll see it in later pages as well, he's the Baruch Hashem man. Ezra doesn't ever make a move without saying Baruch Hashem, right? You know, there are always certain people that we meet and you say, how are you, Baruch Hashem? Well, what are you doing today? Oh, I'm going to, no, Emer Hashem. Or there are some people like that. Ezra was the first one. He was the pioneer of that attitude, that anything I do because Hashem is on my side. As we see right here, he mentions in Pasuk Zayin how he makes Aliyah. Actually, this is the end of Pasuk Tet. Kiyad Elokav Hatova Alav. He recognized that the only reason why I'm able to make Aliyah now is because Baruch Hashem, God is with me. And then he tells us his mission statement. Ki Ezra hechin levavo. Ezra intended his entire heart, his entire agenda in his Aliyah was lidrosh et Torah Hashem, was to seek out the Torah of Hashem, v'lasot, and to keep Hashem's Torah, not just to understand it, right? There are many people that love to learn, but practically they're not necessarily observant. And here it was to learn in order to keep lilmod al manat la'asos, u'lilamed v'Yisrael, and to teach others choku mishpat, all the different kinds of law, and inspire them to, so to speak, keep the ordinances of Hashem in order to understand how the land has to be run. And he was very, very, very successful. So I'm not going through all of the notions of his trip, but some of the things that Ezra really introduced for us is the notion of Tfilas Haderech, understanding that Hashem is always with us. We see throughout his trip the way he garners people to come with him, that he has tremendous faith, and he only wants people with it. If they really can prove their yichus, he wants to make sure that the new community that he's setting up in Eretz Yisrael are completely pure. And he really galvanizes the public because he reaches out to them for their opinion and their buy-in. And that's one of the reasons why he's going to be very, very successful. Similar to the way we saw Haggai and Zechariah working as a perfect tag team, that's going to now be Ezra and Nehemiah. Any questions so far? Okay. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rav Textile, who wrote a magnificent sefer called Eim Habanim Smecha. If you haven't yet seen his book, you should. You can get it in English, you can get it in Hebrew. I think Ezra, from what I can see, at least in Tanakh, you know, from one of the Jews coming back from the Gola into, so to speak, Geula, he, I would say, is your first religious Zionist. You know, Rav Kook probably learned a tremendous amount from Ezra's call to action, and Rav Taxel points it out just a little bit here. I'm going to read you a little bit from something in a book that he wrote called Seder Hadorah, a section of Eim Habanim Smecha where he talks about in Seder Hadorah. Look what he writes. I'm going to skip down where I'm going to, after the 70 years, I'm right over here. After the 70 years of Babylonian exile were completed, the exiles returned to Jerusalem and Eretz Yisrael. Those who settled in Worms, however, did not return. He's talking about what happened in the 1600s in Western Europe. The people of Jerusalem wrote, urging them to come and settle in Eretz Yisrael. There was a community in the 1600s in Eretz Yisrael trying to urge the Jews who were settling in Germany to come as part of Aliyah L'Regel to Israel. I am so sorry. I feel like the news anchors who have all their children in their videos now. Good night. I love you. Like I love you. Sorry. Okay. The people of Jerusalem wrote, urging them to come and settle in Eretz Yisrael so that they could ascend to Jerusalem on the 3 pilgrimage festivals. They paid no attention to this, replying, you may dwell in the great Jerusalem. We will dwell here in the small Jerusalem. This occurred because they were extremely wealthy and very distinguished in the eyes of the ruler and the Gentiles. This is why evil decrees have renewed upon them more than any other community or country. I would like to add, says Rav Tachtal, that perhaps this is why Germany has always been a thorn in the side of Israel from the Middle Ages until today. And I think we can certainly kind of draw a parallel that while Ezra is bringing home many, many more Jews than originally made Aliyah back in 538 and 537 under the Cyrus decree, the amount of Jews that make Aliyah with him now are just over 10 to 12,000. I'm not going through the list with you in Parakhat or Tet. That's really not a lot. So the majority of the population of Jews does remain, despite the fact that there's a Bayit Sheni. And at this point, the understanding is the Purim story has taken place already, Ezra's probably after Achashverosh and Esther. The majority of the Jews are still in Shushan or in the rest of Persia. And that becomes a thorn on their side, certainly once Alexander the Great comes to power and once there's like a separation in his empire. It's not going to be good for the Jews very long in Persia. Persia, under the dominion of Cyrus, Darius, and a little bit Artaxerxes, they flourished. But the rest of the time, it wasn't so simple. And I think Rav Tachtal is picking up on that manner, that if you replace Yerushalayim with a new Medina, basically, then it doesn't necessarily bode well for us. And that's an important message. We talked about this a little bit even the first week when we talked about Kol Dodi Dofek and Rav Soloveitchik and his call to action in 1956. But like I said 2 weeks ago, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite, or a lot of it of a hypocrite. So it's very easy to give Musar from my living room or my dining room in La Brea. So I don't have a good answer why we're all still here. Next, I want to skip to Nehemiah Perek Chet. And the reason why I'm skipping to Perek Chet is because according to most of the Mefarshim, Ezra and Nehemiah, as they work together as a magnificent tag team, you only see them together in this Perek, which is Nehemiah Chet. So essentially, right before we begin Nehemiah Perek Chet, I want to give you a little bit of background on what happens from after Ezra's Aliyah until now, just so you have a little bit of a historical context. Ezra makes Aliyah with his people. He does not exercise his power that he's been given by Artaxerxes, and really he ignites the passion in the people from them. Every time takanos are made, it's because they came to him noticing that there were issues. So he kind of really sets the tone and he allows them to come to him. And the community is much stronger with Ezra there, leading somehow the Kohanim and the charge of the Jews all over Yerushalayim. One of Ezra's biggest acts in the pshat of Ezra is this devastating problem of intermarriage that really brings the people down. And while Ezra noticed it on his own, until people came to him and said, hey, we have a problem. We're noticing that a lot of us are intermarried, and it's actually even happening amongst the Kohanim. He doesn't get involved until the people themselves recognize this blemish, this scar on themselves, right? We often say in adolescence or in growth or wherever people are, if you're not looking for help, it's very hard to help that person. You cannot help someone who's not looking to be helped. So Ezra finds ways to inspire them and to teach them, like I said, was his mission statement. But unless they come to him, that's the only instrument he thinks he has to help them progress. He does help them in terms of this intermarriage, and they take this unbelievable oath where they promise not to do it. The problem is, and I know this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, we know that intermarriage isn't banished forever, right? It's still something plaguing the diaspora community, and not only the diaspora community, unfortunately, even the Jewish community in Israel. And even shortly after Ezra's time period, throughout Nehemiah, we see certain lists that come up that have names of people that doesn't really sound Jewish. And we see in Perek Yud of Nehemiah that there's something called an amanah, a pact. They kind of renew their Nasev and Nishma statement with Hashem. So intermarriage seems to plague the people a lot. Maybe it's because they're not sovereign. They have religious freedoms, but they don't have their own autonomy. And living under Persian control means that they have kind of a lot of mixed messages from the cultures around them. At this point, Darius has created royal roads, and Israel is very much at the center of trade. So while people are coming in and out of the communities of Israel, it could be they're depositing all their cultures there as well. So I'm not going to be quick to judge why it happened, but it is a reality. Intermarriage really, really plagued the community at the time. But that's really Ezra's claim to fame. He begins Anshe Knesset Hagdolah with some really unusual takanos. And one of the things that I find fascinating, and you'll see the proof of that in Nehemiah Perek Chet, is if you ask a student today, a collegiate student on a completely secular college campus today, not Jewish, who doesn't really know from the Jewish people, to ask their, some Jew that they meet in the Hillel house, what does Judaism look like today? Any idea what a typical 20-year-old would explain to a non-Jew on campus? What does Judaism look like? What would you say?
Lighting Hanukkah candles.
Lighting Hanukkah candles, good. Well, Ezra certainly couldn't have said that to them because the Greeks haven't even come to power. But absolutely, is that how you would define Judaism though now? The 8 days of Hanukkah candles? Or are there other candles you might refer to?
They probably
Shabbos candles.
Shabbos candles, of course. What else?
they identify as Jews, whatever that means.
They identify as Jews. So what does that mean? What does it look like to be a Jew? What, like, Shabbos? What is this Shabbos that you do? Imagine you have a non-Jewish roommate and this Jew is there. How is the Jew going to explain to the non-Jewish roommate, what does it mean to be Jewish?
To do good things to other people and so on.
Maybe. Say that again, I'm sorry.
Maybe just to act kindly and do good things to other people, kind of a, not committal in terms of mitzvot, but in terms of general behavior.
So aren't you just describing also, again, I'm playing devil's advocate, not because I disagree with you, especially if that's the message we just saw Zechariah proclaiming, but is there any good Samaritan that wouldn't say that that's a priority?
No, I don't think so, but a common heritage goes along.
Common heritage, okay. But what does that look like in practice?
Belief in God, belief in one God.
What about the Torah?
You could tell them about the Torah. I'm willing to bet if I asked a 20 or a 21-year-old on a secular campus, how would you explain to your non-Jewish roommate what Judaism is or Shabbos is? The first thing you would start telling your roommate is about, like you mentioned, I see the name Mordechai Naor, but I'm pretty sure that your name is not Mordechai.
Samuel.
Okay, that it's Shabbos candles, right? Maybe people would talk about Friday night dinner with challah being covered in wine and kiddush, or maybe Havdalah or something. These are all things that Ezra introduced to us. What we think about as modern, I don't mean modern like modern Orthodox. Modern, I mean like new established takanos is really all Ezra. The centrist Orthodox observance that we have today, it's really all because of Ezra. Shabbos and Yontif looked very different before him. And that's what I want. Go ahead.
Also foods, people identify as, these are Jewish dishes. And this is what.
Correct. That's more cultural, but the kashrus piece also, yes, the cultural foods for sure. If you're going to talk about foods, I will say something, and I'll leave it to you as homework. One of the strangest takanos of Ezra is that he asked people to eat garlic on Thursday nights and Fridays. Actually, I will explain the very strange takana. Did anybody ever hear that before? That is a minhag or a takana to eat garlic Thursday night and Friday?
It scares off the Malach HaMavet.
Eat it all week.
Scares off the Malach HaMavet. Actually, exactly. Well, it definitely does, right? The joke that we make about the smell. But, legend has it, or the understanding is that garlic is considered an aphrodisiac, even if we don't necessarily see that now with the beautiful aroma, especially, right? I happen to love garlic, but it is known as an aphrodisiac. And because intermarriage was plaguing the Jews at the time, Ezra took it in his domain to be almost like a modern Aharon HaKohen, right? I told you he is a descendant of Aharon HaKohen, and like Aharon was Ohev Shalom and Rodev Shalom, and he cared very much about Shalom Bayis, Ezra did the same, and he very much instituted Mamash Takana to eat garlic Erev Shabbos as an aphrodisiac, kind of hoping to encourage husbands and wives to be interested in each other and kind of stay away from the boundaries of intermarriage, which is really interesting that one of his 10 takanos, this is what he does to try to keep the purity of the Jewish marriage really sacrosanct, which is fascinating. So you mentioned culture and food. I couldn't not mention that, but it is interesting. And when I teach college, I always mention that one, and they're like, really? But it's always an interesting to think about. Okay, so speaking about how Ezra somehow modernizes what it means to be, quote unquote, that's why I want to look at Perek Chet of Nehemiah. So, like I said, Ezra and Nehemiah kind of come as a tag team. It's unclear if they literally come at the same time or just both under the jurisdiction of Artaxerxes. The same way we saw Artaxerxes, also known as Artaxerxes, really loving Ezra and allowing him to enforce Torah law, Nehemiah is Artaxerxes' cupbearer, similar to the way we see Sarah Mashkim to Paro, or the way we see, for Ahasuerus, it was very important who took care of his drinks. By the way, those of you that like etymology, look up the word credenza and what the etymology of that word is. Also comes from the idea of cupbearing. But essentially, Nehemiah was also very close to Artaxerxes. And when Nehemiah finds out that the Jews of Israel are living in a forlorn state in terms of broken walls and the cemeteries are overturned, he decides that it's going to be his agenda to make Aliyah, or at least go for a short time, to fix the vulnerability of the city of Yerushalayim. And he doesn't want to ask Artaxerxes for permission to disappear forever, because then Artaxerxes needs him. He trusts him as his right-hand man. So he tells him that he feels like his ancestors are vulnerable and he wants to repair their cemeteries to kind of give them derech eretz. He doesn't really talk about, he mentions that he wants to fix the walls, but he doesn't, God forbid, want to do what happened in the time of Cyrus, where Cyrus gets wind of them potentially building a fortress against him, and he rescinds the declaration. So Nehemiah, in a very, very savvy way, and of course in Persia, Herodotus actually talks about this, the Greek historian, that in Persia you can't make any decision unless you are completely inebriated. So Nehemiah makes sure to give Artaxerxes wine or liquor, I'm not sure, in order to get him to make this decision, and he allows Nehemiah to make aliyah. And he says to him, you have to come back at some point. He tells him, you can't go forever, but you can go until it's taken care of. And Ezra actually takes care, not Ezra, I'm sorry. Nehemiah actually takes care of many, many things. One of the things that he fixes, most importantly, is that he rebuilds the walls of Yerushalayim. Remember, Bayit Sheni is already up and standing at this point. So what he does is he redoes all the walls. And you can actually take a tour in Perek Gimel of Nehemiah. You can actually put the map of the old city of Yerushalayim and walk from gate to gate, which is really fascinating. Another thing that he fixes is there seems to be some kind of like a stock market crash. Like the economy really falls apart in the time of Nehemiah, and there are children that are being sold as indentured servants because parents can't pay the enormous loans that they're being charged by sharks, Jewish loan sharks. And Nehemiah basically forces the Jews to give up their loans and to start keeping Shemitah properly and help other Jews who are forced to sell themselves. So those are like the two big things that Nehemiah does. And what he also does is he defends the Jews against the rabble-rousers. Just like in the time of Ezra, how you had the Amei Haaretz and the Shomronim taunting the Jews and ultimately got them to cease construction on Bayit Rishon. In the time of Nehemiah, there are also a lot of people taunting the Jews. But Nehemiah is undeterred by them, and that emunah does translate down to the people, and they are not afraid. They continue to build those walls with tremendous strength. After that story, and again, lists and lists of censuses, we constantly see lists. Again, you can devote hundreds of shiurim just to talk about why there are so many lists in Ezra and Nehemiah. But right after that, we get to the story in Perek Chet, and that's the story that I want to focus on now. So we get to Perek Chet, so understand now the walls of Yerushalayim are built. We haven't heard from Ezra at all for like the last 12, 13 years. And then all of a sudden we get to this story. And this will become kind of like the highlight of the Shivat Zion period, where we really see the messages of Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, and Nehemiah coming to fruition and manifesting itself in a way where the Jews are inspired to really run the community the way a frum community ought to be run. Here, Perek Chet. Vayesfu kol ha'am ki'ish echad. So notice how the parak begins. The entire nation gathers as one man. So again, the biblical allusion here is clearly to Matan Torah, where they're standing ki'ish echad, complete unity. El harechov, they're standing in the grand plaza, asher lifnei Shar Hamayim, in front of Shar Hamayim, that is now completely fixed up because Nehemiah rebuilt the walls. Vayomru le'Ezra hasofer. Again, I told you, it's the only parak where we'll see Ezra and Nehemiah work together. The people approach Ezra, which I told you is what always happens. He waits for the people to be inspired. He doesn't reach out to them. He inspires them to want to be inspired. Vayomru le'Ezra hasofer. They say to Ezra the scribe, Lahavi et sefer Torah Moshe, bring to us the Torah, the original Torah from Moshe, Asher tiva Hashem es Yisrael. So there is one sefer Torah that was written by Moshe, and it was placed in the Aron together with the broken luchos. So they want to read from that one. Now, I want to just point out a couple things before we go forward in this parak. The milim manchot, the late words, the words that keep repeating in this parak, just to kind of show you what the theme is here. You have the word sofer, which comes up a lot. Sofer or sefer, which means a scholar or a scribe, which means that the text is something that's very important to them. Which is, I run the Judaics department in Eula Girls High School. To me, it's very important to understand that without text, if it's just fluff, although fluff is important, but if it's not totally anchored in the text, then what are we? And you see that here from this time period, that they very, very much understand that they have to be anchored in the text. Look how often that word comes up. What other words do you see here as a milah mancha?
I keep saying ha-sefer, sefer.
Correct. So that's what I'm saying. Sefer and sofer. That shows us how text is so important. Good. What other word keeps coming up?
Ha'am.
Ha'am. That it's all about the unity of the people. It's not ha'anashim, it's ha'am. It's this unity, this cohesive group keeps coming up again. Good. What else?
Mevinim?
Right. Mevinim lahavin, this idea of understanding. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And remember, I think about our college student for a second. What does Judaism practically look like? So wait till you see certain things here in Nehemiah that I bet you, most yeshiva brachim don't realize what the source is for this halacha. Okay, so they come to Ezra and they say to him, and we don't know when this is, and they say to him, we don't yet know, we'll find out soon, read to us from the Torah of Moshe. Pasuk bet. So Ezra, invigorated by the people's approach, Vayavi Ezra HaKohen et HaTorah lifnei HaKa'al me'ish v'ad isha, he gathers men, women, v'chol mevin lishmo, and anyone who could hear and possibly understand. So some Mefarshim, the minority of Mefarshim, seem to think that it meant people of discernible age, meaning they were old enough to understand. And those Mefarshim actually also say that means we shouldn't be bringing babies to shul. Shul, I don't even know what that means anymore. I haven't been to shul in over a year, but it means that you shouldn't be bringing kids to shul, making noise and distracting other people, that it should only be people that are part of this Kriyas HaTorah that have some kind of a Havana. But the majority of Mefarshim seem to think that that's not what the case is. That Ezra understood that if the Jews wanted to hear Kriyas HaTorah, they don't want to just hear it and be Yotze. They want to hear it Kidei Lahavin, which is so aligned with what Ezra's agenda was. His whole agenda, as we saw back in Ezra Perek Zayin, was to make Aliyah in order lilmod, lilamed, vilaso, to learn so that he can teach others to observe. And that's what's going on here. He brings this Torah, he gathers the people, me'ish v'arisha, v'chol mevin lishma, and the people are gathering to hear so that they can understand, right? There's a very big difference between hearing and listening or understanding. And what happens to be the date? Tells us the pasuk b'yom echad l'chodesh hashvi'i. All right, biblical professors in my Zoom right now. What is yom echad l'chodesh hashvi'i?
Chodesh Hashvi'i is a Pesach.
Rosh Hashanah.
Pesach,
It's Rosh Hashanah.
The 7th month, we always start from Nisan, right? HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim, Nisan Rishon lachem l'chodshei Hashanah. We learned that in Perek Yud of Shmos. So the 7th month is
It's Rosh Hashanah.
That's correct. It is Rosh Hashanah right now. And it's Rosh Hashanah, and they come to him, read us from the Torah. Now notice, Rosh Hashanah is not Shalosh Regalim. So they're gathering, even though there isn't a commandment here of pilgrimage. Pasuk Gimel, Vayikro bo l'fnei rechov, he starts to read in front of all the people in this grand plaza, v'hamevinim, and he has people there, and they're called mevinim. And these are people that essentially are standing. Now again, there's no microphone. There's no Zoom room where you could be standing in the back of Yerushalayim hearing what's going on in the front. So he placed people, most of whom were Leviim, but he placed people who had tremendous Havana of the Torah throughout the Kahal, in the mass squares of Yerushalayim, to make sure that anybody that's outside that's listening to the Kriyas HaTorah could understand it. If you're there and you don't understand what you're listening to, it's worthless, according to Ezra. So we had these people set up all over the place. The Ozne Kol Ha'am El Sefer Torah, and everybody was listening attentively to the reading. Now look at this. Vaya'amod Ezra HaSofer. Ezra, the scholar, stands up al Migdal Eitz, on a podium of wood. Huh. Mazeh.
The bima.
A bima. Did you ever see that in the Torah? Is that a midioraita thing? Nope. Here is your makor for a bima in a shul. And that's where Kriyas HaTorah takes place from. Vayamod Ezra Sofer al Migdal Eitz Asher Asula Tafar. They created this just for that time. Now it could be, and I should probably ask Rabbi Dr. Ephraim Kannerfogel, who was one of my favorite teachers when I was in Stern, who has studied the history of Minhagim better than anyone I know. Whether or not he was standing on this podium, maybe Ezra was short. Maybe he just wanted to see people in the back. It could be that this is not necessarily something that we do that's steeped in a source with a reason. I don't know. And I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying, I remember Rabbi Kaddish is saying always you have to look at the source, but I find it fascinating that the concept of a bina, the Medrash Tanchuma talks about it. I have a few other sources I don't remember offhand. If anybody wants, I can look it up after. Talk about this as the source for the bima. Vayamod etzlo matitya v'sheman, and there's a whole bunch of people, I think 8 names of people that are standing right next to him to his side. Pasuk hey. Vayiftach Ezra HaSefer, he opens up the scroll. He opens the scroll. Do you think it's Sephardi or Ashkenaz, this Torah scroll, based on the way it talks about him opening it?
Sephardi.
Definitely, probably Sephardi. That is probably the understanding. Vayiftach Ezra HaSefer le'enei kol ha'am. We know that language. What is that? What's he doing?
Hakba.
Hagba, here we go. Ki me'al kol ha'amaya. He's above all the people. Remember, he's on this bima. So here we see Hagba. Ukipitcho, and when he opens it, amdu kol ha'am. The people are all standing up. Again, this sounds like or looks like what we do in Shul. Vayivarech Ezra es Hashem. Right, this is Berchas HaTorah. Again, things that we see straight from Ezra that has now come down to our, modern understanding. Vayivarech Ezra es Hashem Elokim Agadol. Vayanu kol ha'am. Amen. Amen. Bimo al yedehem, right? Pointing with their fingers, right? What do we say when we see during Agba? Coming straight out of Ezra, right here. Bimo al yedehem, vayiktu vayishtachavu Hashem, and they bow and they're praying to Hashem. Apayim Arta v'Yeshua Ubani, and then again another list of people. V'halevinim mivinim etam. In the meantime, the whole time there are people there enunciating to the kahal, to the assembly, to make sure that they have not only buy-in because it's exciting, but that they understand what's going on. Mivinim etam la Torah, teaching them Torah v'ha'am al amdam, and the people are standing. Vayikru b'sefer b'Torah to Elokim miforash. They're reading the pshat. V'som seichel v'yavinu b'mikra, and they put their minds to really understand, and because they're being read to it in a way that's explained to them. And the people don't just want this done ceremoniously. They want this to resonate for them. They want this to be something that's internalized. We haven't seen this before.
What language are the people speaking?
Great question. So I believe they were probably speaking Lashon Kodesh. Again, I can't answer you that, but I don't know that they were. I'm sorry, but they were not necessarily they were reading it, but they were probably speaking Aramaic. These are Persian Jews who made Aliyah. For the most part, they're speaking Aramaic, and one of the reasons why we know that, and it's interesting that Nehemiah does it here. He refers to the months as Chodesh Hashuv'i, but in most of the Prakim of Nehemiah, the months are not referred to the way biblically, like the 7th month, the 8th month, the 9th month. They're referred to by their Aramaic names, their calendrical names, which is what we saw in Ezra, that the Beis HaMikdash was completed in the month of Adar. Why is it calling it Adar? And that's nearly 60, 70 years before this, because the Jews were very, very acclimated with the culture around them. So the chances are that the majority of people spoke Aramaic, whether they read some people still read Akkadian or Phoenician. The Phoenician was they definitely have like this phonemic language, but certainly the Talmidei Chachamim amongst them, if we're going to call them that, definitely understood Torah in Hebrew. So when I say they spoke Hebrew, I'm talking about the people that are Mevinim. They definitely had to understand Torah law. Some of them even knew to read already the difference between Ktav Ashuri and Ktav Ivri, but there's a lot of essays written about that. At what point during the Ezra period does the font get changed, so to speak? Rashi himself, to make a joke, never read Rashi font. He could. Rashi was sitting next to me, he could not read his own font.
Why did they change the font? I'm not sure.
In the time of Ezra?
Whenever they changed it, why did they change it?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have a good answer. Does anybody here know a good answer for that? Why they changed the font?
Yeah.
I do know that the font that was more pictorial, meaning the symbols that they had represented the meaning more than the letters we have now. The most obvious example is the letter ayin. Literally looked like an eyeball. Like if you drew an oval with a dot in the middle, that's the letter ayin. One of the most fascinating to me is actually the letter taf. Right? When we say from aleph ad taf, this is what the taf looked like, which is an X. And the concept of X marks the spot, the finite letter, that's what it used to be. I don't know why they changed it. I'm sure there are people that are much more versed in the history. I can look it up, but I'm not familiar. I don't know.
Especially when we say for one letter, when we're reading the Torah, is miswritten, the Apostle Torah. Here's all the letters are miswritten.
Right. So people say that that's why they had to have a copy of Moshe's Torah, because they had to always go back to the original. Mr. Nachumson, you look like you have some knowledge on this idea.
I believe it's the influence of the Aramaic language that changed over the script from Savi.
In terms of the symbols?
I think so.
But the Aramaic is far more cursive.
That's my understanding, but I could be wrong.
I'm not familiar. So either myself or Mr. Nachumson is going to do some research and get back to you.
Okay.
And I'm hoping it's going to be Mr. Nachumson.
Oh, dear.
Okay. Okay. So what I find fascinating is that the people are really inspired to do something, not just in practice, but also in their minds. And that's what we're supposed to be. It's supposed to be in our neshamas, in our leiv, and also in our seichel. And it's really the first time since the Jews have come back to Israel where we kind of see this notion of the sense of abandonment and forsakenness is no longer a part of them. They're no longer struggling with, Hashem left us and now we're here under these despotic rulers. We don't get that sense here. And that's a real high. When you talk about rebuilding out of ashes, right? That's our whole agenda. So much of it is in the mindset. And if you build it, he will come. If you decide, like Rav Rafal Palkovitz, to have this som seichel, right? Som moach, and that's what simcha is, we get to make a decision. You can't help but quote either Viktor Frankl or, for some people more famously, what does lama mean according to Rav Soloveitchik? You don't ask lama, you ask lema, now what? It doesn't help me to ask why something happened, because that's up to Hashem, and he'll either explain it to me or he won't. And that's not really my business. But lema, the question that Rav Soloveitchik says is, I can change the question a little bit. I could say, okay, now what? Now what do I do? And this is a generation of people, despite the fact that the majority of Jews were still living back in Bavel/Persia, they decided that they are going to build a community of continuity. And they have a tremendous legacy. I do not want to shortchange their successes, even though Bayit Sheni never actually reaches the apex of Bayit Rishon. And that's something that we really have to keep in mind. Okay. Go ahead.
Could it be that it never reached that apex because not enough of the Jews came back?
According to Rav Tachtal, according to Rav Soloveitchik, according to the Malbim, yes.
Oh, I'm in good company.
You are in very good company. And there's also an opinion that believes that we had to keep a group in Bavel, and I'm using Bavel colloquially to really be anything at that point outside of Israel, all over Mesopotamia at the time, is because when Bayit Sheni is going to be destroyed by the hands of the Romans, many Jews are settling back all over, whether it's Surah, Pumbedita, or not yet in those cities, but ultimately what's going to become, real houses of Torah study for the Jewish people outside of Israel. And had they not already been comfortable in those places, I don't know if they would have had places to run. Now, they would have, because Hashem promises us that we'll never be completely obliterated without a place to go. But that is a little bit, maktim refuah lamaka. There is a concept that there had to always be a presence there of Jews so that we had what to come back to. And look, we have the entire Talmud Bavli because of it. Again, it's not coming out of this time period. Don't misunderstand me. But Talmud Bavli doesn't come until way after Bayit Sheni. But the communities have already begun after Churban Bayis Rishon, and they don't all go back to Eretz Yisrael ever.
One more thing.
Please.
I'm thinking of now, and some people say that it's not meant for everybody to go back to Israel. Some of us need to be outside, almost so that, same thing what you're saying. It's a very scary thought.
So I don't disagree with you. And again, that might be my Yetzer Hara that doesn't disagree with you, because I am living outside of Eretz Yisrael. And it's very easy for me to tell you, well, I have to be here. If I wouldn't have been here, I wouldn't have been principal at Eula Girls High School. Rabbi Top wouldn't have known who I am to reach out to me. And I wouldn't have been able to come and learn with all of you fine people at Beth Jacob. But is that my Yetzer Hara? Maybe. Or my Gaiva? Maybe. I don't know. Did I go with you through the pasuk in? I think I might have looked with you at the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, the source for whether or not we're supposed to be in Yerushalayim. Did I talk to you about this at all?
I don't think so.
Okay, so I'm going to look for a source right now. Give me 1 second. I'm going to look it up. So when the Jewish people first start being completely eradicated, literally, and exiled from the cities of Yerushalayim. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, yes.
Okay. So when they start being kicked out, it happened in phases. I talked to you about this the first week that we learned together, that Nebuchadnezzar chased the people out. First was the Cheresh Masker, the elite, and then it was the children in order to brainwash them, and then ultimately it was the rest of Judea. But as it started happening, there was really a rift psychologically and mentally and even halachically, so to speak, from the Jews living in Yerushalayim. Some of them believed that the Jews that were kicked out were the bad ones, and Baruch Hashem, they're out. Now we're all pure again. And Yirmiyahu was trying to teach teach the Jews that were remaining in Israel, specifically the horrible king Yehoiakim and later Tzidkiyahu, that the Jews that were kicked out, they were the good ones. And that's why Nebuchadnezzar took them, because he wants to learn from them to build his new perfect culture. And the reason why Hashem lets them go first is because Hashem is being maktim lamaka, that he wants to set up like Hatzivu lachem tzionim, like Hansel and Gretel. Hashem wants to set up for you breadcrumbs in a new community, which is really the recipe for our survival, because what Yirmiyahu does is he gives them that menu for how to survive outside of Eretz Yisrael. But many Jews listened to the Nevi'ei Sheker at that time of Yirmiyahu, when the Nevi'ei Sheker, the false prophets, are saying, oh, no, the Jews are coming back. They're going to be back in the 2 years. They're coming back just in 2 years. And Yirmiyahu has a very strong warning for them right here in the end of Perek. I think it's Perek Chav Zayin. It might be the end of Perek Chav Het. Yes, right here in the end of Perek Chav Zayin. He has to really go louder than the Nevi'ei Sheker. And he says something that's the source actually for the Satmar understanding against religious Zionism. Look here in Pasuk Chaf Aleph. This is just as some of the Jews have already been exiled. Ki ko amar Hashem tzvakot Elokei Israel. This is what Hashem has to say. Al hakelim hanotarim beit Hashem. The vessels that are still in the Beis Hamikdash that have not yet been exiled, ubeis Melech Yehuda, and the treasures from the king's house in Yerushalayim. What does Yirmiyahu promise? Bavela Yuvau. They too are going to be exiled together with the Cheresh Umasker. V'shama Yihiyu, and there they shall remain until when? Ad Yom Pakdi Otam, until the day that I, again, that word pakad, we talked about that a lot, until the day that I appoint them, remember them, whatever way you want to translate the word pakad, those vessels are going to stay there until the day I decide, says Hashem. The ha'alitim, and then I will bring them up in aliyah, the hashivotim, and I will return them el hamakom hazeh. This is the source, the original source for some sects of Hasidim, in particular the Satmar, that we have no right to decide when to create a state. Hashem said through his vehicle Yirmiyahu, if I send you to Galus, you are there until I bring you back. Now, whether or not Shivat Zion was Hashem's oracle, many would say yes, and we looked at that through Cyrus. But there are people who still believe that 1948 was not that call. Even though we had a state, and even though it was voted in, and even though the Holocaust gave us no place of refuge, if Hashem did not call us back with a bastion of calling from a nevuah, and we go despite that, that's what Yirmiyahu is saying we should not do. And if we do go back without that permission, that prophetic oracle, then all we're doing is we are mimicking the people of the Ma'apilim, which was the story right after the Meraglim, that after they said to Hashem, okay, we're so sorry, we know the spies were wrong, we want to make Aliyah, Hashem says, no, you're now staying here for 40 years, and each day you cried is going to be for another year. They said, no, we're going, and the next morning a whole bunch went up, and they were killed by, they were called the Ma'apilim, and they were killed by the communities that came down because the Hashem's protection wasn't there. And this call to arms, so to speak, that Yirmiyahu has, saying you cannot make aliyah, you cannot come back until Hashem says ad yom pakti otam, is a big deal. And I think that might have been a little bit the conflict that the Jews at the time of Bayit Sheni have. They want to build, but who is Cyrus to tell us to build? Certainly we know that in modern times, after the founding of the state of Israel in 1948, there is an understanding that there is a source for why people don't want to go back. And I'm not saying I'm on that side. I'm clearly a religious Zionist. Like I told you, even though I'm a hypocrite, I believe I should be in Israel. And I believe we have a right to the state, and it's a good thing, and it's a bracha from Hashem, and Yom Ha'atzmaut is a chag for me. But you have to understand that it's not just made up the other side. And maybe it's important to talk about this as we end, because even if we, as Zionists, I know Beth Jacobs is very much a Zionist shul. Every year I've lived here except for COVID. I've been to Beth Jacob for Yom Ha'atzmaut programming, but I do think that the message that Zachariah had of social justice and equal and being open and understanding each other's opinions is what's going to allow us to go back when Hashem wants us to go back. And
in all deference to the Satmar, there is no nevuah. So how they know when God is taking them back?
Right, but again, and I agree with you, but we don't know that he did. And again, it could go back to the same thing in the time of Cyrus. There wasn't a nevuah either, which is why only 42,000 went up. We can play that game. I want to end by talking about a bird. I know that sounds funny to talk about a bird. How many of you are familiar with the phoenix? In Hebrew, it's called the ofchol. So there's an amazing song, I could potentially look for it on the internet right now, by where am I? It's not working. Hold on a second. present. There's an amazing song that was written in the last 2 years by, what is his name in Israel? Ofchol Ari, Hanan Ben Ari. Have you heard of him? Where he writes a song that actually I think was sponsored by the One Family Fund, the Victims of Terror in Israel, where it talks about the phoenix, the ofchol, which is a bird that kind of reinvigorates itself. Again, it kind of burns off a part of it. Very, very strange. I actually wrote down, as I just saw it, I was looking for it. I'm going to tell you a story, actually. There's a famous story about where this comes from. So I'm going to read this to you. If you have a minute, I want to read to you about the Greek legend of the phoenix. So just so you know, and this is, straight from Rabbi Google, the Greek legend of the phoenix, the fabulous bird, I'll stop sharing for a second, the fabulous bird that lives forever is mentioned in apocalyptic literature and various addenda. As for example, that its food is the manna of heaven and the dew of the earth, and from its excrement, the cinnamon tree grows. This is from the apocryphal writings. Some contend that Ofchol, mentioned in Eov, is the phoenix bird. It is translated in the Septuagint, while the Midrash explains it as referring to the bird which lives for 1,000 years. At the end of 1,000 years, fire comes out of its nest and consumes it, and leaves behind of itself about the size of an egg. It reproduces limbs and lives again. Another view holds that after 1,000 years, its body is consumed, its wings molt, and it renews itself. This idea of a bird renewing itself after a great age is applied elsewhere to the griffon vulture. However, it is not blah, 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 it goes on and on. So I heard a beautiful story that there was a sculptor, I don't know if you're familiar with in art, there was a sculptor named Jacques Lifshitz who died while he was in the middle of building a sculpture of the phoenix. And his wife very much wanted to finish this sculpture and was told by her frum community that it's not appropriate because it's not a Jewish symbol, the phoenix, not a kosher animal. So she went to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe, very fascinating story. And after his passing, she went to see the Rebbe, and talking to the Rebbe, she mentioned that her husband really wanted to finish this abstract phoenix, and it was a work that was commissioned by the Hadassah Women's Organization for the hospital in Har HaTzofim. So if you've ever seen it, please go to Har HaTzofim. That bird is there now. She herself was also an artist and a sculptor, the wife, and she wanted to complete it. And she went to the Rebbe saying, I don't know what to do. I want to honor his wishes, but I'm being told that this is not from. The Rebbe opened up a Tanakh. The Lubavitcher Rebbe opened up a Tanakh in front of this woman, and he read to her from Perek Chaf Tet of Eov, and I have the pasuk quoted right here for you. And he reads this pasuk: V'omar im kini egva v'kachol arbe yamim. I will perish with my nest, and I will multiply my days as the phoenix. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe continued to explain to Mrs. Lipschitz that the Midrashic commentary on this pasuk in Eov describes the ofchol, this phoenix bird that lives for 1,000 years and then dies, and it's later resurrected from the ashes. This is what the Lubavitcher Rebbe explained to her. Clearly then, he told her, this is a Jewish symbol. This is what it means to have emunah. This is what it means to be a Jew. Mrs. Lipschitz was absolutely delighted. She completed the project shortly thereafter. And true to his nature, from what I remember, I went a few times to the Lubavitcher Rebbe when I was a child living in New York, but he discerned the positive when conventional wisdom saw only negativism. And I think for us, how fitting it is in retrospect, that this magnificent metaphor, and with this, I'm going to end this series. If you think about how to rebuild out of ashes, especially if you think of the ofchol, the phoenix, how beautiful. This metaphor of life returning from the ashes. In his own very divinely inspired way, the Lubavitcher Rebbe brought very, very real hope to this widow. And in this recurring theme of his life, as we know from the Rebbe, he did the same for the spirit of Jewish people all over the world. And he raised all of us, really, all of our communities from the ashes of the Holocaust to a new invigorated life. And I think he was able to do that because he knew the stories that we saw from Ezra and Nehemiah and Chaga and Zechariah, that hope comes here. And if you want to rebuild from the ashes, essentially, you're going to light yourself on fire and you're going to do it, like that ofchol. And with this, I'm going to wish you a beautiful Purim, and urge you to check out Hanan Ben Ari's song, Ofchol. It is really beautiful. Thank you, everybody, for learning with me.
Thank you.
It's been a privilege.
Thank you so much for a wonderful time and a wonderful series. And we look forward to learning again more soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yishar koach.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.